Hello everyone, welcome to this session of critical analysis and game critical analysis and games. I'm Renata Delia, I'll be the chair for this session, and we'll start right in with our first paper, which is by Penny Switzer and Matthew Aitchison. I'm terribly sorry if I butchered your names. Which is about rewards and the system of rewards as a potential harmful design. I'll be sharing the video, and then we can have questions to the presenters.
Hello, I'm Penny Switzer from the Australian National University. In this video, I'll present our paper, Do Gamebots Dream of Electric Rewards, along with my PhD student, Matthew Aitchison. We'll follow the same structure as the paper, covering the key points. Please refer to the paper for the full details and feel free to contact me for more information. Our paper explores rewards, motivation, and play to understand and question our practice of designing reward-based systems and technology. We examine the design and psychology of reward-based systems and technology using gamification and machine learning as case studies. We propose that motivation, exploration, and play are not just fundamental for humans, but that they could transcend nature into machine learning. We also question the value and potential harm of reward-based systems and assert the importance of centering ethics in the design of all systems and technology. The concept of reinforcement emerged from the field of behaviorism and the work of B.F. Skinner in the 1950s. Skinner experimented with operant conditioning in what became known as the Skinner box. He investigated how positive and negative reinforcements could alter and control the behaviour of organisms. In the Skinner box, a rat or pigeon starved to 75% of its body weight was required to learn that pressing a lever would drop a food pellet or remove an electric shock. In behaviourism, organisms are collections of behaviours, responding to their environment. Controlling the environment will control the behaviours and therefore the organism. Our societies are bound with Skinner boxes, with schedules of reinforcement underpinning our classrooms, workplaces, and families. According to Alfie Kohn, rewards are unethical and ineffective. They're unethical because they aim to control an individual's behaviour to the benefit of the controller rather than the individual. And they're ineffective as they devalue and demotivate the behaviour itself, and the individual will cease the behaviour when the rewards stop. Intrinsic motivation means doing something because it is inherently interesting or enjoyable, whereas extrinsic motivation means doing something because it leads to a separable outcome. In the late 1950s, it was observed that many organisms engage in exploratory, playful, and curiosity-driven behaviours without reinforcement. In the 1980s, self-determination theory was proposed to explain motivation based on psychological needs. Competence is a need for challenge and feelings of affectance. Autonomy is a sense of volition or willingness. And relatedness is a sense of belongingness and connectedness to others. Satisfying the psychological needs can enhance intrinsic motivation, whereas external rewards can undermine intrinsic motivation. Rewards can also be experienced to be more or less controlling depending on the contingencies. Things like threats, deadlines, and competition pressure are experienced as controllers. Rewards can also be given informationally without attempting to control the behaviour. The rewards themselves are almost incidental, with the greater issue being the control versus self-determination of human behaviour in a social context. Flow is a similar concept where the activity is extrinsically rewarding and autotelic, and the goal is often an excuse for the process. Games are an example of an autotelic experience with motivational pull that has potential for use in other domains. Gamification is the design strategy of using game design elements in non-game contexts. The design of these elements is key to whether the system will play to intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. Play is a fundamental component of games, and games do not exist without play. Rules, structure, and goals alone do not constitute a game. The most commonly used form of gamification have been points, levels, leaderboards, and achievements, also referred to as reward-based gamification. These types of systems play to extrinsic motivations. Reward-based gamification is tempting to use as it's easy to implement and has an immediate effect. Meaningful gamification uses game design elements to help build intrinsic motivation and meaning in non-game settings. It helps a user find their personal connections to motivate engagement for long-term change. An important question to ask is, to what extent are we seeking to control versus support the user? Consistent with self-determination theory, reward-based gamification can be experienced to be more or less controlling. Leaderboards can be experienced as a form of goal setting, and achievements can be experienced either intrinsically as competence boosts or extrinsically as ego boosts, depending on the design and the player. If we take a user-centered approach, asking how does this benefit the user for each design decision, we can seek to empower rather than control the user, putting the user first and the organization second. Going back to Cone, we can ask, is this gamification effective and is it ethical? And we can also ask the same question when we're designing games.
Let's have a look at how this applies to machine learning. If we wanted to solve a game like chess, we could apply a method called reinforcement learning. It's really easy. All you need to do is assign rewards to good outcomes with positive values, and then assign negative rewards to the bad outcomes that you don't want. For example, in chess, we could just say that if you win, we give 1 point, and if you lose, we give -1 points. The algorithm's job is then just to learn how to maximize its score. But chess, it turns out, is quite complicated, right? Because if you lose a piece, that might actually be a good thing if you gain a positional advantage. Therefore, the algorithm needs to learn to make short-term sacrifices in order to gain long-term advantages. But this is fine because we actually learn the value of every single state within the game. And this allows us to make these kinds of trade-offs. So this works. And in fact, it works really, really well. In practice, we can build an algorithm using reinforcement learning that can give superhuman performance with chess. And then there's an example there with David Silver's work. However, what happens if we look at a much simpler game? So this game here is called Montezuma's Revenge. It's made for children, and it runs on the Atari 2600 emulator, and it turns out it's much harder than chess. So why is that? Well, the reason is because of the rewards. In chess, we always got some useful feedback, +1 if we won, -1 if we lost. But in this game, we almost always get 0 reward. And the reason for that is, in order to get our first reward, we have to get to the key. And so the agent within this game needs to learn how to climb down a ladder, jump over to another platform while grabbing onto a rope, then needs to learn how to climb down the next ladder, jump over a skull without getting touched by it, climb up another ladder, and then jump up and get the key. It needs to learn how to do all of these things without failure in order to gain that first reward. And unfortunately, the chances of doing this by just random trial and error is extremely unlikely. In fact, it usually takes millions of actions before it'll ever achieve this once, and sometimes it just simply never achieves it at all. So how can intrinsic motivation help? Well, as we've seen, extrinsic motivation can sometimes be insufficient to learn how to play a game, but intrinsic motivation can really help us a lot. In fact, here's an algorithm called ICM, the Intrinsic Curiosity Module. And what it does is it gives the agent its own reward for whenever it takes actions that it can fail to predict the consequences for. So what happens is the agent, before it takes an action, will have a little guess at what's the consequences of that action will be. And then once it takes the action, it checks to see whether it was right or wrong. If it was wrong, it assigns itself a small bonus. And this will encourage the agent to revisit parts of the game that it doesn't fully understand yet, parts of the game where it doesn't know the outcome of its actions. And so this works quite well. In fact, in Mario, using just this intrinsic reward, the agent's able to explore the first third of the level. And this is without any information. So it's not told what it needs to do, it's not told that it needs to live or it needs to explore. It's just using this intrinsic motivation. And it learns how to kill enemies, how to avoid death, and how to explore part of this level. So as we've seen in reinforcement learning, extrinsic reward just by itself really isn't sufficient to solve problems. Even fairly simple problems that humans can solve, machines can't do just using extrinsic reward. In fact, we now use a lot of intrinsic motivation in many of the popular reinforcement learning algorithms.
Both machines and humans struggle to learn in an environment where external rewards are the only motivator. Reward-based systems can also be designed and used in an unethical way, so we must place ethics front and center in our design process. Biologically inspired computing affords us the ability to hold a mirror up to ourselves. There is value in not just improving our computing techniques, but also in questioning our assumptions about our world and ourselves when designing systems. In answer to the question, do gamebots dream of electric rewards? Maybe they do, but only by our design. As Elfie Kohn said, let us be more than a society of loyal Skinnerians unable to think our way out of the box we have reinforced our way into. Thanks for listening. Please feel free to contact me if you've got any questions about this paper or any of our other work.
That was a very interesting paper. Unfortunately, I've been informed that the authors couldn't be present because they live in Australia, so the time zone is quite different. For that reason, you can contact them either in their contact details or on Discord, where they will be able to answer and have a discussion with you regarding their subject. We'll move to the next speaker, Jesper Juhl, who's going to be talking about types of games, independent, especially games, and if there is a better way to define them. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, and I'm sharing a screen, and you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I just want to say thanks to the FDG organizers for going through the conference. I think it's important that we kind of continue to do things and meet and discuss, and we don't just sit around waiting for a miracle. And so I'm glad to have the option to present a short paper here. So my starting point is this, right? There seems to be a thing called independent games, or that people call independent games. So here's an example. It looks like an adventure game, but you must wait for hours in real time to take part in an exhibition at MoMA in New York. Another one, two rabbit-like creatures quip existentially about burning up in lava. A more recent one, Stillstand, is about being depressed in your 20s, unsure what to make of your life in this kind of hand-drawn, kind of 2D style. And so this short paper is kind of a note to this book I wrote about independent games. And so the argument in the book, Handmade Pixels, is that independent games, even though they're digital, are often kind of promoted as these kind of handcrafted, authentic objects. And it's built about this kind of quest for authenticity that I see in independent game design. And it's a book that both looks at kind of developers and at game design and at festival organizers and all these kind of things, the history of independent style, and has this kind of institutional history of independent games. So I think I tried to answer that question, what is an independent game? But I didn't really answer the question, what kind of thing is an independent game? And by extension, what kind of thing is a casual game or a mobile game or AAA game? And I'll be trying to give a framework for that. So the way I defined or talked about independent games was I borrowed something from G.F. King. He talks about 3 kinds of independence. So a game can be, or a film can be independent in its industrial location. So in its kind of financial or where it's made or by who, aesthetically, in terms of like doing something that's different in some kind of way, like narrative or visually, and culturally, like by making kind of larger claims. And so there are some kind of phases from roughly 1999 to 2000. Most early independent games were really just financially independent, like trying to just make AAA games in a different way. Then from roughly 2005 to 2012, there was a period of aesthetic independence, things like kind of retro pixelated platformers, where the people tried to do something that was somewhat differently aesthetically. And roughly from 2012, we see a trend of kind of cultural independence, people making games that try to have a kind of larger cultural value or make a kind of political statement or things like that, right? And so that's the kind of way I looked at it. And then you can look at an individual game and see like, how does it actually kind of play into these? Like, how does it present itself as an independent game rather than ask like, is or isn't it, right? But then that doesn't really answer that question, like what kind of thing is it, right? So is the independence really a financial arrangement or a style, etc.? And I think you can ask similar questions about anything we typically use to label games, like casual or hyper-casual, core or mobile, etc. And again, I borrowed from film theory, and I do feel that film theory has just kind of theorized history a lot better than has been done so far in games. And so I borrowed from this book, The Classical Hollywood Cinema by Bordwell, Steiger, and Thompson, and they have this idea of the mode of film practice. So a mode of film practice is something that exists at a certain time, and this kind of things are produced in a certain way under certain kind of conditions. It also involves a set of conventions. So like in classical Hollywood cinema, you'd often have a problem that needs to solve and is interweaved with a kind of heterosexual romance, for example. And often you have a kind of implicit viewing procedure. So we assume that people who watch a kind of normal Hollywood movie are interested in like emotional relation to the kind of narrative and so on. And then you have other kinds of films like art cinema might be less about kind of causality and often have these kind of open endings, for example. So let's think about this in relation to kind of independent games. So a recent game, NeoCap, is built as an emotional survival game. And so in this case, we can think, where does it fit in historically? Well, it came out in 2019. It's clearly a game that kind of matches the kind of indie festival circuit. It's in a time of digital distribution, so you can get it on different platforms. It has certain kind of conventions. So it uses this kind of visual novel-like kind of setup. Most of the focus is really on kind of conversation. It has this kind of retro neon style. And those things actually serve to differentiate it from kind of mobile games or from AAA games. And then you can see like the viewing playing procedures. In a way, it's a game because you're a cab driver in this kind of Uber-like situation. You're constantly getting these kind of stars from root customers. It's very clear that you're encouraged to read this as a political commentary on precarity and on emotional labor, like having to treat customers well, even though they're very rude to you, and so on and so forth, right? So this is the way you can see, like, this is the way that a game like this kind of fits in an independent mode, right? Both kind of financially and in terms of the way it's designed and in terms of the way it's kind of encourages people to play it. So that's the kind of analysis. Then this is a short paper, so it's quick, right? So the question then, if you do something like this, I think the point for me is to avoid these kind of disciplinary preferences. Like, I'm a humanist, so I kind of intuitively look for meaning in the kind of design, and other people have different kinds of preferences. So if you do it like this, you try to look at all these kind of different components, and at the same time, there's a kind of danger of circularity, right? That you say, like, if something works in this, if something exists in NeoCap, it has to work, right? And this creates this kind of danger of circularity. And I think it therefore becomes important to look at counterexamples. And so a kind of interesting counterexample to me is Flappy Bird from 2014. In a way, this kind of pushes a lot of indie buttons, right? So it's made by a single developer. It kind of it remixes all these kind of Nintendo tropes and types of graphics. And the developer even made this kind of argument that he wanted to make a game that wasn't too addictive. He wasn't too successful on that, I think, right? But then the reception of the game actually was that sites like Kotaku wrote about how he was a kind of cynical developer who just ripped off games and made money off it, right? And so why did people choose to view the game that way rather than in another way? And I think one way to see that is that because he wasn't part of a Western clique of indie developers, people weren't really willing to give him this kind of position as someone who kind of smartly remixed kind of game history, right? And so it wasn't really made available, that position wasn't being made available to someone who's an indie developer in Vietnam. And I think this kind of analysis, what that does is that you can look at what happens if a game isn't actually accepted by that kind of whole system, right, of the kind of the independent mode. And I think it becomes a way to kind of reveal also kind of problematic assumptions about who counts as an indie developer. And I think this is something we can see when we make this kind of analysis. And so, so that's the analysis, right? So it's like you think about, you don't just kind of argue about is the business or the cultural context or the design or the player culture are more important. You try to say, well, how do all these things interact, right? And so typically you look at like the historical existence, how was this game made, where does it exist, in which context, you look at the design, and you look at the kind of playing procedures that it kind of encourages so that people actually use. And then in the paper, I kind of elaborate this a bit more and talk about how you can look at different kinds of games, both kind of culturally independent games I talked about here, or things like the modern casual live game, which is continually updated, like Candy Crush or Heyday, or the single purchase AAA game, and this kind of history, like what each kind of game mode actually entails and involves. So that's the point. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you very much for this very interesting paper. If anyone has questions, please speak up or write it in the chat. But in case anyone is still making up their mind, I have a question for you. Because you based your approach, or it was inspired by film studies, I would like to know if you see any correlation with Nouvelle Vague's position in film history and how they were also considered these enfants terribles people of cinema that came to, break the waters. And if it's just a stunt as much as this independent game scene you describe it.
But I think in most kind of cultural art forms like music and kind of cinema, you have various kind of waves or literally, right, or metaphorically, where people in a way try to make a kind of carve an outside position. You see, like the new wave is kind of obviously kind of one variation of that. And so in the book, I also talk about, actually people talk about independence in different times. There's also like the 1970s or the Jim Jarmusch's of the world and so on. And I think in the book, I make the argument that it actually takes a while for this to happen in games. When people were making small games in the 1980s, they were not thinking of themselves as being kind of alternative or oppositional. That actually only comes really like at the late 90s, or at least that people start talking about that as a position. Of course, you kind of need kind of a sufficiently developed and entrenched industry for people to feel that that's kind of that counter position is kind of interesting, right?
Yes, absolutely. Any other questions, comments, remarks? Of course, there's Discord where you can find maybe a more comfortable space for you to contact the author. Thank you very much for your paper. We'll be moving on to the third and final paper of our session. It's a paper by Ida Jorgensen and Twan Bodgers. Again, I'm terribly sorry if I'm mispronouncing this. We're going to be talking about how gamers redefine or describe games that they want to find from earlier days. A very interesting subject. So, are the presenters present?
Only me.
Great. Great. You have the floor whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So can you see the slides?
Yes, we can. It's not full screen yet.
Yeah, I think it will be in a minute. Yes, okay.
Great.
Okay, so hi everybody. On behalf of my co-author Twan Bodgers and I'm of course delighted to present our study on games refinding requests on Reddit. So our study concerns a subreddit called Tip of My Joystick, which is dedicated to helping users find games that they have once played or watched other people play, but have now forgotten the title of. So to find a game, users will post a request with a description of the game in question, and then based on that, other users can then suggest the title of the game. And some users will use a shared template to organize the request. And at the time of our study, it contained 7 headlines such as platform, graphics/art style, notable gameplay mechanics, and so on. So the reason why we found this subreddit interesting is that it offers opportunities for studying how users recall and describe games. So as a Tip of My Joystick is a site for searching for games, it's of course relevant to consider how these searching behaviors can inform research on game archiving. So this research often focuses on what aspects of games should be collected and how they should be preserved. And this of course poses a challenge, since games are these complex, multifaceted artifacts, as we know, but they're also processes. And this complication is evident from the sheer number of classification schemes and ontologies produced by game studies. But these often focus on the game object itself and not on the discourses on games, which is the focus of this study. It should also be noted that fans and players play a significant role in game archiving and preservation, and as such, the current approach can be seen as a way to utilize existing efforts of retro gamers to shed light on the game searching behaviors they use. So refinding can be described as the act of searching for a so-called known item, which is an object that the user knows or is convinced exists, but only have a limited description of. So refinding practices on Reddit have already been studied by Bodgers et al., who analyzed game requests for the purpose of informing search algorithms. In comparison, our study looks at these game descriptions from a game studies point of view and is informed by existing game ontologies. Okay, so what we did was this. We had a Reddit crawl the subreddit from the 1st to the 22nd of June 2018, and it collected a total number of 1,131 threads. So we analyzed only the initial request, which is the post title and the first comment. So we started by doing an open coding of 65 requests each, which resulted in a total number of 74 different codes. We then use affinity mapping to categorize and synthesize the codes until we arrived at our final coding scheme. And using this coding scheme, we then coded a total number of 250 requests, of which 50 requests overlap between the two of us. And we did that to be able to measure inter-annotator agreement, which turned out to be moderate, which only shows that coding these requests is far from straightforward, and it involves a lot of interpretation. So this is our final coding scheme with 9 top-level codes and 38 low-level codes. Only the low-level codes was actually assigned to the requests, and the top-level codes were then subsequently inferred for the later analysis. So The average number of codes assigned to a request was around 7, and this figure here shows the relative frequency of the codes. I'm just going to point out a few interesting findings. First, it should be noted that the most frequently used codes describe aspects of the game object itself, as well as metadata about it. So aspects relating to the experience of playing the game or any extrinsic purpose it might have were less frequently used. And this is, of course, highly unsurprising given the purpose of these games requests. It should also be noted that the most frequently assigned codes overlap more or less with the admin's template I mentioned earlier. And I've highlighted the codes here. They are graphics, gameplay mechanics, characters, hardware and platform, and release date. But the figure also shows that beyond that, there is actually a richness in the game descriptions that are not catered for by the template itself. For example, we can look at the codes that is used less frequently, but still over 20%. I have highlighted some of them here. They are, for example, perspective, ludic structure, setting, and plot. And I think this shows that there is actually quite a lot of nuance in these descriptions. So of particular interest is the two codes, exposure and similarity, that appear with a relative frequency of 32% and 22% respectively. And here you can find a few examples of texts assigned these codes. So similarity reflects a practice of comparing the sought after game with another game or with media more generally, of which the user actually knows the title. So this practice of comparison is probably something a lot of us recognize when describing games, but it's actually not part of the template. Also note that similarity can be used in a positive manner to say that a game is like another game, but it can also be used in a negative manner to say that something is unlike another game. And also note that these comparisons are often relative to some aspect of the game. So for example, you could say that one game is like another game with respect to its graphics or its mood or its gameplay and so on. Context of exposure is another interesting code that was assigned quite a lot of requests. Sometimes it's used in a functional manner, for example, as a substitute for a precise release date. So I played this game around 99, for example, or it could be used to inform about hardware and platform. But as you can see from the examples here, they are also used to communicate information that's not strictly useful for the purpose of refinding games, at least on this subreddit. So instead, we might see this as acts of sharing memorable moments of play with other people. As Duck et al. Puts it, fans and players typically understand games as a set of experiences. And in their study of a collective public archive, they show how the layman users of that archive focus not only on the game object itself when they are describing them, but also where they were first played and with whom. And we can see something similar here. So to conclude this extremely short presentation, the focus of this paper was just to capture the richness of the game descriptions found on this subreddit. But our study prompts interesting questions. For example, it would be quite interesting to see if it's possible to find any patterns in the codes relative to the historical period in which the game in question was released. One could, for example, speculate that developments in hardware or game distribution would affect the game descriptions in terms of what aspects are deemed relevant to include in them and which not. We also didn't look into the demographic characteristics of the Reddit users on this subreddit, but it would be interesting to see if there are any variations in the game descriptions relative to demographics. Finally, we also only looked into the initial request and we didn't account for its success or failure. So if other users were actually able to suggest the correct title of the game. But this information is of course highly useful if we want to optimize game refinding. And with this, I want to thank you for your attention. This was a very brief presentation, but read our full paper, and if you have any comments, feel free to ask now or contact us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We have a comment in the chat. Dr. Gerland, do you want to speak up or? can we just answer? Or if you have already a comment to make?
No, I think it's a very good point. The comment is about how meaningful this calculating this intercoder agreement is, because they are non-exclusive, so you can assign a variety of codes to the same request, right? And I think that's absolutely correct. Another thing that I was thinking about, like we come to this study from two different perspectives. I come with a game studies background, and my co-author comes with an information science background. And I think like our interpretation of what information was actually offered by the request differed quite a bit. So at least in a sense, this calculating this shows, you know, what we as researchers put into the request. It at least it shows, you know, the challenges of this kind of you know, interpretive practice. But yeah, good point.
Great. So any other questions? Oh, but by the way, in the chat, I'm seeing that you're a doctor now, because last time I saw you, yeah, congratulations then. Is Jonas' comment follow-up, or do you want to maybe speak up if you want to? We have some time if you want to talk more about it. In the meantime, I also have a question. You mentioned or referred to it briefly in the beginning about how this approach may affect or eventually change the genres and how they are defined top-down. Maybe this bottom-up approach can have an effect. Have you seen a tendency, or do you speculate that there may be something?
I think I don't mention it so much in the presentation, but there is something about it in the full paper. The concept of genre was part of the template, so it was mentioned quite a bit in the game descriptions. But we actually saw that a lot of the times, like, and genre is, of course, as we know, a concept that's also been challenged quite a bit in game studies, and I think at least that also affected my own interpretation of the request, right? So I only coded genre when it was specifically named as such, because otherwise it would typically often when they talked about genre, they would actually talk about perspective, for example, or they would talk about mood, or they would talk about what we coded as gameplay mechanics, or ludic space, and so on. So there was like a lot of other things hidden beneath that genre concept. And I think that like two things that just testifies to the fact that genre is something that is a problematic concept, not only for game scholars, but also in the way that it's actually used by players. But also you could see how, compared to the other things that were part of the template, genre appeared quite significantly less frequently than the other things. So I think that shows that even among players, there's like some tendency to use use other means to describe than using the genre label specifically.
Great, thank you very much. We also have a question by Jesper Juhl.
Oh, thanks. This is super interesting. So I think there's like an infinite amount of things that could be interesting. I was just wondering whether you think do people have any kind of self-consciousness when they're asking? So might there be kind of games they feel bad about asking about, or do they sometimes want to kind of appear like in the know when they talk about games? Like, or could it be that like if you go to different fora, there might be different ways of asking?
I haven't seen anything from the sample that we worked with that would indicate that, I think.
Okay.
But I would be reluctant to give like a full answer, because we only coded the first request, right? So the whole conversation that sort of expands after that, we haven't studied. So there might be, you know, some kind of you know, things going on there. But I think most of the requests, they were just like fairly, like they had the game description and then typically some kind of motivation. I really loved playing this as a kid. You know, it was my favorite game, and I'm so sorry I forgot the title of that. But other than that, they were relatively brief.
Okay, thanks.
Great. I don't see any other hands raised or questions in the chat. Oh no, they're just saying thank you and how interesting the papers were. Indeed, this was a very interesting session. Since we only had 3 papers, we have some time left. If people want to discuss or chat in text, the room will be open. We'll be moving on room 1 for the keynote. And at 5:30 Malta time, we'll be returning for our last session for today, which is game and education. And at 6:30, again in room 1, will be the demos and competitions. Thank you very much for your presentations and the audience for their attention. Hope you enjoyed it.